Thanks, Magella, and welcome everybody. So my name is Professor Eileen Murphy, and I'm from the School of Natural and Built Environment in Queen's University Belfast. I'm a bioarchaeologist, so I specialise in the study of human skeletal remains, and I'm also very interested in burial practices. I've been the long-standing editor of the journal Childhood in the Past, which I hope you can see here. So it's worth having a look at if you're interested in the archaeological sort of perspectives of children and childhood in the past. I've also edited a couple of books relating to children in the past. So there's Children, Death and Burial. And another edited book was trying to actually look across the generations. So it's looking for the old and the young, and we were on the quest for sort of grandparenting relationships in archaeological evidence. So discussions of children are relatively rare within the archaeological record for Ireland, although it goes without saying that every adult would once have been a child and the island would have been full of youngsters throughout its past. The funerary treatment of children by medieval Christian communities in general has also been largely ignored. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the funerary practices afforded to individuals aged less than 18, buried in the later medieval Christian burial ground at Ballyhanna, which is located in Ballyshannon in County Donegal. So this burial ground was excavated in 2003 and 2004 by IAC Limited on behalf of Donegal County Council and the then National Roads Authority. As you can see from the plan, it was a substantial burial ground, and around 1,300 human skeletons were discovered, and 437 of these were juveniles less than 18 years. Most of the burials dated to AD 1200 to 1650, so it's largely a Gaelic medieval, later medieval population. So whenever we find a large population of juveniles, it really can help us to learn more about the lives and deaths of Ireland's Gaelic medieval children. Now, it's perhaps obvious to state that the living were responsible for burying the dead. So the funerary rituals that we can see in the archaeological record, they provide an insight into the religious beliefs and agency of the living and the nature of the relationship they may have had with those they buried. So all members of the community seem to have been buried at Ballyhanna. There were the remains of adult men and women and children of all ages. A preliminary examination of the burial practices indicated that most of the individuals, so both adults and juveniles, had been given typical Christian burials. So these are when the head is orientated to the west. So this is because it would enable the dead to be ready to see Christ as he rises from the east at the day of judgment. And they had mostly been buried in simple earthen graves, and most of these would have been individual. As you can see from these pictures and from the photograph, most of the bodies were lying on their backs. So we would say this is a supine position, and they'd mostly have had straight legs with their arms positioned alongside the body or over the pelvis or sometimes across the chest. Now, there were some atypical adult burials, and I'm just going to briefly talk about these before moving on to the juveniles. Many of these were associated with religious items, such as pieces of quartz, or in one case, a scallop shell, which is suggestive of pilgrimage. And it was interesting that some of those who were afforded these sort of atypical burial positions would have suffered from chronic diseases like tuberculosis, as you can see in the individual to the left, and you can see in the little inset some of her vertebrae, which have basically collapsed one on top of the other because she'd been suffering from this disease for a long period of time, and others showed major physical impairments. So we concluded that these individuals may have been identified as having a special character in life. You know, maybe they were particularly holy individuals, or maybe they were people who were known to have undergone terrible suffering due to disease or some injury. Now, as I looked through the excavation plans, it was clear to me that around a quarter of the juvenile burials also displayed very subtle differences in relation to the position of their body, you know, their association with others, and even the inclusion of objects within the graves. So I decided to explore these further. Now, the juvenile population, it contained children of all ages. So as you can see in the graph, there were a very small number of preterm babies. There were more full-term or neonatal babies represented. But it's very striking that the majority of the juvenile population died between the age of 1 and 6 years. And this seems to have been a very vulnerable time for the Ballyhannah children. If they survived beyond this age, they seem to have a relatively good chance of getting to adulthood, because we have smaller proportions of older children and adolescents represented in the burial record. So the majority of juveniles were buried lying on their backs with straight legs, as we would expect, given the Christian nature of the burial ground. But some were found lying on their sides, and sometimes they had flexed legs, so basically bent legs. And as you can see from the pictures, these could be flexed at quite a pronounced angle, or they could be a little bit more subtle. And this was particularly the case for babies and the youngest children. Now, in my view, laying a body on its side, and or bending the legs is clearly a very deliberate choice. And it may be the case that these were simply regarded as more restful poses, and that they were viewed as being more suitable for the very young, as opposed to the very sort of rigid, extended supine position. So could it be the case that families wanted the very young children to look as if they were sleeping, peacefully in their graves? So we had some particularly poignant burials at Ballyhannah that involved 2 or more individuals who must have died around the same time, and then a decision was made to bury them together. So we have 2 burials that serve as a reminder of the dangers of childbirth for medieval women. So this is one example when you can see a young woman was pregnant when she died, but you can see that the head of the baby is very far down in her pelvis. So it's very probable that she died during childbirth. Now, another very petite young woman, she seems to have survived the birth of baby twins, only for all 3 of them to have died then soon after. So you can see the mother, and then there's two little, you can see the rib cage is most pronounced. So we've got skeleton 986 sort of lying at the top, and then 979, so that both babies' heads would have been sort of resting on the mother's abdomen, and her hand was over the body of the lower baby. So it's a very kind of poignant positioning. Skeleton 823 was a 68-month-old infant, and it because we don't know what sex the baby was, seems to have been laid sort of carefully positioned on the centre of the body of an adult male. And it does seem that it was considered appropriate at times for children to have been buried with adults who weren't their mothers. So you can see that the baby is positioned in a way that they sort of are sharing the space of the adult entirely. Now, this little baby would have been sick when it died, and it showed evidence of active rickets on its skull and on some of its long bones. Now, you might imagine it would have been quite difficult to acquire rickets in rural medieval Ireland. And one possible explanation is that this may have been a particularly sickly child, and that the parents then, to try to look after the baby, they kept it indoors so it wasn't getting exposed to enough sunlight, and eventually then went on to develop rickets, and sadly, this contributed to the child's death. So the careful positioning of the babies with adults in both of these cases is suggestive of tenderness and perhaps some concern to protect the children in the afterlife. So the last aspect of funerary ritual apparent at Ballyhannah that I want to briefly look at involves the inclusion of items within the graves of some of the juveniles. So over to the left here, you can see the plan of skeleton 100. So this was a little neonate, and it was associated with 3 bronze pins which had been carefully placed around its head. So perhaps this is the remnants of a headdress, or perhaps the baby had been buried with a chrism band, which indicates that it may have been baptised. An older child over to the right here, skeleton 652, was associated with an iron whittle-tanged knife, so you can just about see it inside the red circle. And the location adjacent to the waist is suggestive that the item may have been worn on a belt. So in these two cases, we seem to be looking at part of the attire of the children, but we also find artifacts that seem to have a different character. And this is quite interesting because in Christianity, where the soul is believed to leave the body at the moment of death, the inclusion of grave goods is generally considered to be unnecessary. So as such, we would not expect objects to have been added as grave goods to the burials at Ballyhannah. But we did find a very small proportion, so we're only talking around 6% of the juveniles contained objects that do seem to have been deliberately deposited. So the most common grave item across the entire cemetery population were quartz pebbles. And one of the sort of features that we found in the cemetery was an early medieval reliquary box shrine, and this seems to predate the burial activity. And we think then that a funerary practice that might have been related to this shrine was the inclusion of white stones in the graves of some individuals. Now, the inclusion of white stones in funerary contexts is a tradition of notable longevity, and it's been associated with pre-Christian and also then Christian burial grounds throughout Ireland and Britain and further afield. So it's thought that maybe before they were deposited in the burials as votive items, that the stones might have been placed inside the reliquary shrine, and this would then, enable them to become sort of charged, if you like, with the spiritual power of the saint, whose name we don't know, unfortunately, but the person who was associated with the graveyard and church at Ballyhannah. And we found white stone associated with the head, shoulder, or the hands of 8 of the juveniles. Similarly, a small number of juveniles also had a glass bead placed, either at their skull or at their skull and at their hip. We know that a couple of the adults also were associated with glass beads. So there was a middle-aged woman had a set of 15 beads at her neck, and we think these may have been the remains of a paternoster or rosary beads. Another young adult female had a single bead discovered at her pelvis. Now, when dealing with sort of later medieval burials in England, Roberta Gilchrist has suggested that single beads were sometimes used in the graves of later medieval children to help protect against the evil eye. Now, given the inclusion of quartz in certain burials at Ballyhannah, it does seem feasible that glass beads were being used in a similar votive manner. Perhaps they were considered holy and suitable burial inclusions because perhaps they originally formed part of, religious sets like rosary beads. Now, apparently mundane and everyday objects, so things like pottery sherds, metal slag, nails, and fragments of metal objects were also included with 7 juveniles. Now, such objects are frequently just dismissed as accidental inclusions within a grave, but I noticed that there was a spatial patterning to some of these items that actually mirrored that of the quartz and other more definitive grave goods. So I think it's unwise to completely dismiss these everyday objects, as accidental. And I think, again, some of them might have been deliberately placed in the grave, and it's interesting to think why. So this is a nice picture, and it just shows 2 little girls playing shop with broken crockery. And, even children today tend to like, collecting little bits and bobs. And if you think about it, if kids are still doing this today, when they have formal toys, back in the past, I'm sure such items would have been even more precious, before toys became very commonplace and abundant playthings. So we might even imagine that interesting organic objects like conkers or maybe even little rush figurines might have also been present in some of these burials, but their remnants have long since disappeared. So maybe like a little shiny nail or a blob of slag may have been a treasured possession of the dead child, or maybe of their friends or siblings who wanted to give them a last gift for the afterlife. Now, an alternative explanation that might account for some of these items again goes back to the idea of sort of folk magic and the fact that they maybe were sympathetic charms. Roberta Gilchrist, again, for later medieval England, she's noted a long folk tradition of women using magic and charms to protect their families, and she has suggested that this protection extended into the burial sphere. So if you think about it, grandmothers and mothers, amongst others, they may have included charms, particularly those related to domestic life, to protect those who were considered to be the most vulnerable dead, so often the children, in the afterlife. Now, 2 juveniles, and an adolescent and an older child, were associated with what we call pillow stones, and you can see that in the image to the right here. Now, some suggest that pillow stones may have been a form of punishment because the individual's head may have been uncomfortable and cold, or that they may have been included as a sign of penitence. But I think, if we return to the idea that some of the juveniles had been laid out in ways that mimicked natural sleeping positions, that maybe the inclusion of a pillow stone with juveniles is a variation of this idea. And we know that organic soft pillows have been found in a number of later medieval burials in England, but these require exceptional preservation conditions. So I hope I've given you a flavour of some of the various burial practices that were afforded to the juveniles at Ballyhannah. So as I undertook this research, I was struck by the fact that, yes, the majority of burials follow the Christian format, but we can find subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences in a minority of burials. And I think we can actually connect more with the people of the past and learn about their personal choices through these atypical practices. So presumably family members would have been largely responsible for the burial of their loved ones. And I can imagine, grieving parents or siblings wanting to do something personal for the dead child. So they may have strewn flowers on top of the body, which are of course now invisible to us. And I also think, it is possible that families would have wanted these dead children, particularly the youngest ones, to look as if they were sleeping peacefully in their graves. And the inclusion of various objects and furnishings within burials, I think it's also compatible with this notion of tenderness. So religiously charged items may have been included to afford the child with a degree of protection in the afterlife. Treasured collectibles such as pretty stones or pottery sherds, they might have been regarded as a final gift to the dead child. And we have to remember that this is a society where they would have had very little. So maybe these were, little treasured items. So Roberta Gilchrist has observed that the material culture of later medieval burial grounds in England overlapped with the domestic sphere of the home, and that sometimes drew upon older folk practices. And I think that the presence of material remains within the juvenile burials at Ballyhannah, it seems to support this assertion. And I think that the sort of positioning of dead children in their graves as if they are asleep is a further connection to the domestic sphere and the comforts of home. Thank you.